Jack Reacher had no reason to stop in Alcorn, Nevada. The town was a speck of dust on the map, a place you passed through on your way to somewhere else, the kind of town that baked under the relentless desert sun until it was bleached of all color and interest. But the bus had a cracked radiator, and the driver, a man with a face like a worn leather glove, announced a 4-hour delay. 4 hours in a town that looked like it had died, and nobody had bothered to tell it. Reacher stepped off the bus and into the oppressive heat. The air was still and thick, tasting of dust and distant rain that never came. Alcorn consisted of a single main street, flanked by low, flat-roofed buildings that seemed to sag under the weight of the sun. A diner with a flickering neon sign, a gas station with antique pumps, a sheriff's office, and a handful of other storefronts with faded paint and grimy windows. Nothing to hold a man's attention. He walked into the diner, the only place that showed any signs of life. The bell above the door gave a tired jingle. A woman with a weary face and hair the color of straw looked up from behind the counter. She wiped a glass with a cloth that had seen better days. A couple of old-timers sat in a booth nursing cups of coffee, their conversation a low murmur that died as Reacher entered. "Coffee," Reacher said, taking a seat at the counter. His voice was a low rumble, out of place in the quiet diner. The woman poured him a cup without a word. The coffee was black and strong, just the way he liked it. He drank it slowly, his eyes scanning the street outside. A sheriff's car, a dusty Ford Crown Victoria, was parked in front of the office. A man in a khaki uniform, tall and broad-shouldered, with a gut that strained the buttons of his shirt, stood on the sidewalk, watching the diner. Reacher felt the man's gaze on him, a heavy, insistent pressure. It was the kind of look a predator gives its prey, a look that sized him up, measured him, and found him wanting. Reacher met the sheriff's eyes through the diner window and held his gaze. The sheriff didn't look away. A silent challenge passed between them, a declaration of territories and a warning. After a few long moments, the sheriff turned and walked back into his office. Reacher finished his coffee. The woman refilled his cup, her movements slow and deliberate. "Heard about the bus," she said, her voice flat. "Happens all the time. Old junker." 4 hours, Reacher said. "Could be worse," she replied, a hint of something dark in her tone. "Could be you decided to stay." Before Reacher could ask what she meant, the door to the diner swung open, and 2 men walked in. They were big, not as big as Reacher, but they carried themselves with an air of practiced menace. They wore jeans and work boots, and their arms were covered in crude tattoos. They ignored the woman and the old-timers and walked straight to Reacher. "You're in my seat," the bigger of the 2 said. He had a shaved head and a scar that ran from his eyebrow to his lip, pulling his mouth into a permanent sneer. Reacher looked at the empty stools on either side of him. "Plenty of other seats," he said, his voice calm. "I want that one," the man insisted, pointing a thick finger at the stool Reacher was sitting on. Reacher took another sip of his coffee. "Not a good idea to want things you can't have," he said. The man's face darkened. He exchanged a look with his companion, a silent signal that passed between them. The second man, who had been quiet until now, moved to Reacher's side, his hand reaching for something under his shirt. Reacher saw the movement out of the corner of his eye. He'd seen it 1,000 times before. The subtle shift in weight, the tensing of the muscles, the telltale bulge of a weapon. He knew what was coming. He moved first. In a single fluid motion, he was off the stool, his elbow driving backward into the second man's ribs. There was a sickening crunch of bone, and the man gasped, his breath leaving him in a pained rush. He crumpled to the floor, clutching his side. The first man was taken by surprise. He hadn't expected Reacher to be so fast. He fumbled for his own weapon, but it was too late. Reacher was on him, his large hands grabbing the man's head. He slammed the man's face into the counter, once, twice, a third time. The sound of bone hitting formica echoed through the silent diner. The man went limp, his body sliding to the floor in a heap. Reacher stood over the 2 men, his breathing even, his expression unreadable. The old-timers in the booth were staring, their mouths agape. The woman behind the counter hadn't moved, but her eyes were wide with a mixture of fear and something else, something that looked like respect. The bell on the diner door jingled again. The sheriff stood in the doorway, his hand on the butt of his gun. He looked at the two men on the floor, then at Reacher. A slow smile spread across his face, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Well now," the sheriff said, his voice a low drawl. "Looks like you've made quite an impression on our little town." Reacher didn't say a word. He just stood there, a silent giant in a dusty diner, a storm that had just rolled into a town that was already dying of thirst. He had a feeling his 4-hour delay was about to get a lot longer. The sheriff, whose nameplate read Brody, had Reacher in a cell within 10 minutes. It was a clean cell, surprisingly so for a town like Alcorn. The bars were solid steel, and the lock was new. Brody didn't bother with questions. He just took Reacher's passport, the only form of ID he carried, and locked him up. "Just until we get a few things sorted out," Brody had said, his voice laced with false sincerity. "Wouldn't want you wandering off." Reacher didn't mind. He'd been in worse cells. He sat on the narrow cot, his back against the cool concrete wall, and he thought. The two men in the diner weren't just local toughs. They were professionals. Their movements had been coordinated, their intentions clear. They had been sent to test him, to see what he was made of, and they had been sent by someone who knew he was coming. He thought about the bus breaking down. It was too convenient. A cracked radiator in the middle of nowhere. It was a classic setup. Someone had wanted him in Alcorn. But who, and why? He had no enemies he knew of in this part of the country. He was just passing through, a ghost on the landscape. But someone had seen him. Someone had recognized him, and someone had set a trap for him. The hours ticked by. The sun began to set, painting the desert sky in shades of orange and purple. The heat of the day began to fade, replaced by the cool of the night. Reacher sat in his cell, a patient man, a man who knew how to wait. It was well after dark when he heard footsteps in the hallway. It wasn't Brody. The footsteps were lighter, more hesitant. A woman's voice, the same woman from the diner, spoke to the deputy on duty. A few moments later, she appeared at the bars of his cell. Her name was Sarah. She was holding a tray with a plate of food and a cup of coffee. She slid it through the slot in the door. "Thought you might be hungry," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Reacher looked at the food. A steak, potatoes, and green beans. It was a good meal. A meal you didn't expect to get in a jail cell in a forgotten town in the middle of the desert. "Why are you here, Sarah?" Reacher asked, his voice low. She looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and desperation. "Because you're the first person who's fought back," she said. "The first person who's stood up to them." "Them?" "Brody," she said, her voice trembling. "And the men who own him." She told him about Alcorn. She told him how the town had once been a thriving mining community, how people had come from all over to work in the silver mines. But the silver had run out, and the mining company had packed up and left, leaving behind a ghost town and a handful of people who were too poor or too stubborn to leave. Then, a few years ago, a new company had come to town. They called themselves Ethelred Enterprises. They bought up the old mines, the abandoned buildings, the land. They promised jobs, prosperity, a new beginning for Alcorn, but the jobs never came. Instead, Ethelred brought in their own people, hard men with cold eyes and guns on their hips. They sealed off the old mines, posted armed guards around the perimeter, and turned Alcorn into their own private kingdom. Brody, who had been the town's part-time sheriff, was suddenly on Ethelred's payroll. He had a new car, a new uniform, and a new attitude. He was their enforcer, their attack dog. He kept the town in line, made sure no one asked too many questions, made sure no one got in Ethelred's way. "What are they doing in those mines?" Reacher asked. Sarah shook her head. "No one knows," she said. "But people have disappeared. People who asked questions, people who got too close. They just vanish." She told him about her brother, a young reporter who had come to Alcorn to investigate Ethelred. He had been asking questions, digging into the company's past. Then, one night, he was gone. Brody said he'd packed up and left, that he'd gotten tired of small-town life. But Sarah knew better. She knew her brother would never have left without saying goodbye. "I think they killed him," she said, her voice breaking. "And I think they're going to kill you too." Reacher ate his steak in silence. He listened to Sarah's story, and he saw the pieces of the puzzle begin to fall into place. Ethelred Enterprises. He'd never heard of them, but he knew their type. They were the kind of people who preyed on the weak, the kind of people who took what they wanted and crushed anyone who stood in their way. He had stumbled into their web, and now they were coming for him. The two men in the diner were just the beginning. There would be more, and they would be more dangerous. "Why did you help me?" Reacher asked, his eyes meeting hers. "Because I saw the way you looked at Brody," she said. "You're not afraid of him. You're not afraid of any of them." She paused, her gaze steady. "I need your help," she said. "Help me find out what happened to my brother. Help me expose Ethelred. Help me take back my town." Reacher finished his coffee. He looked at Sarah, at the hope and the fear in her eyes. He hadn't come to Alcorn looking for a fight. He had just been passing through, but a fight had found him. And Jack Reacher never walked away from a fight. "Get me out of this cell," he said. The lock on Reacher's cell was new, but it wasn't complicated. A paperclip, a bit of wire, and a steady hand were all it took. Sarah had provided the tools, smuggled in with another tray of food. She had also provided a distraction, a loud argument with the deputy about the quality of the jailhouse coffee. It was enough. Reacher slipped out of his cell and into the darkened hallway of the sheriff's office. The deputy was in the front office, his back to the cell, still arguing with Sarah. Reacher moved silently, a large shadow in the dim light. He took the deputy down with a single, precise chop to the back of the neck. The man slumped to the floor without a sound. Sarah looked at Reacher, her eyes wide with a mixture of awe and terror. He'll have a headache when he wakes up," Reacher said. "But he'll live." He found his passport in Brody's desk. He also found a map of the area, a detailed topographical map that showed the old mine shafts and tunnels that riddled the mountains around Alcorn. And he found something else, something that made his blood run cold. A file with his name on it. It was a thick file, filled with information about his past, his military record, his movements since he'd left the army. Someone had been watching him, tracking him, for a long time. They knew who he was. They knew what he was capable of. And they had been waiting for him. "We need to get out of here," Sarah said, her voice urgent. Reacher nodded. They slipped out the back door of the sheriff's office and into the cool desert night. The town was quiet, the streets empty. They moved through the shadows, sticking to the alleys and the backways, until they reached Sarah's small house on the edge of town. It was a simple house, neat and tidy, but there was a tension in the air, a sense of fear that clung to the furniture and the walls. Sarah had been living in fear for a long time. "My brother's notes," she said, pulling a locked metal box from under her bed. "He kept everything in here. I think he knew they were onto him." She opened the box. It was filled with notebooks, files, and photographs. Reacher spent the next few hours going through the material, piecing together the story of Ethelred Enterprises. Sarah's brother, a man named Daniel, had been a good reporter. He had been meticulous in his research, and he had uncovered a web of corruption and deceit that stretched far beyond the small town of Alcorn. Ethelred was a front, a shell corporation for something much more sinister. The company was involved in illegal arms dealing, smuggling, and money laundering. They had connections to rogue governments, terrorist organizations, and organized crime syndicates all over the world. And the mines in Alcorn were the heart of their operation. They weren't mining for silver. They were using the old tunnels to store weapons, to move illegal goods, to hide their dirty money. They had turned the mountains into a fortress, a hidden stronghold in the middle of the American desert. Daniel had found out too much. He had gotten too close to the truth, and Ethelred had silenced him. He was trying to find a way in, Sarah said, pointing to a hand-drawn map in one of Daniel's notebooks. A back entrance to the mines, an old, forgotten tunnel that wasn't on any of the official maps. Reacher studied the map. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble. But it was the only way. He couldn't take on Ethelred's army of mercenaries head-on. He had to be smarter, faster, and more ruthless. "I'm going in," Reacher said. Sarah looked at him, her eyes filled with a new kind of fear. "You can't," she said. "They'll kill you." "They'll try," Reacher said, his voice a low, hard rumble. He left before dawn. Sarah gave him a backpack with water, some food, and a flashlight. She also gave him a small, snub-nosed revolver that had belonged to her father. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. He walked out into the desert, the first light of day painting the eastern sky. He followed the hand-drawn map, his long strides eating up the miles. The sun rose higher in the sky, the heat becoming more intense. The desert was a harsh and unforgiving place, but Reacher was used to it. He was a man who was at home in the empty spaces, the places where other men got lost. He found the entrance to the tunnel late in the afternoon. It was hidden behind a rock fall, a narrow opening that was barely big enough for him to squeeze through. The air inside was cool and damp, a welcome relief from the heat of the desert. He turned on his flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing a long, narrow tunnel that stretched into the blackness. He took a deep breath and stepped inside. He was in the belly of the beast, and he was going to tear its heart out. The tunnel was old and unstable. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. Reacher moved cautiously, his senses on high alert. He could hear the drip of water from the ceiling, the scuttling of unseen creatures in the darkness. He followed the tunnel for what felt like miles, the hand-drawn map his only guide. He passed side tunnels and collapsed passages, the forgotten remnants of a time when men had torn the earth apart in search of silver. After several hours, he began to see signs of recent activity, new timbers shoring up the walls, discarded food wrappers, the faint smell of cigarette smoke. He was getting close. He rounded a bend in the tunnel and saw a faint light ahead. He switched off his flashlight and moved forward in the darkness, his footsteps silent on the dusty floor. The light was coming from a large cavern, a natural chamber that had been enlarged and reinforced. It was a storage depot, a warehouse carved out of the rock. Crates and boxes were stacked to the ceiling, filled with weapons, ammunition, and explosives. 2 guards stood at the entrance to the cavern, armed with assault rifles. They were talking in low voices, their words echoing in the vast space. Reacher waited in the shadows, listening. They were talking about him. They knew he had escaped. Brody was in a panic, and the man in charge, a man they called the Colonel, was on his way. Reacher knew he didn't have much time. He had to move fast, he had to hit them hard, and he had to disappear before they knew what had hit them. He took a rock from the floor of the tunnel, a piece of granite the size of his fist. He weighed it in his hand, judging the distance. Then, with a flick of his wrist, he threw it. The rock sailed through the air and struck a pile of empty oil drums on the far side of the cavern. The drums clattered to the ground with a loud crash. The guards reacted instantly. They raised their rifles and moved toward the sound, their flashlight beams cutting through the darkness. It was the opening Reacher needed. He moved out of the shadows, a silent, deadly force. He took down the first guard from behind, a single powerful blow to the base of the skull. The man dropped without a sound. The second guard heard something and turned, his eyes widening in surprise as he saw Reacher. He tried to raise his rifle, but it was too late. Reacher was on him, his hands a blur of motion. He disarmed the guard and drove his knee into the man's stomach. The guard doubled over, gasping for breath. Reacher finished him with a quick, efficient elbow strike to the temple. He dragged the 2 bodies into the shadows and took one of their rifles, an M16. He checked the magazine. It was full. He was no longer unarmed. He moved deeper into the complex, a ghost in the machine. He found more storage caverns, more guards. He took them out one by one, silent, methodical, and deadly. He was a one-man army, a force of nature that Ethelred had never anticipated. He found their communication center, a small room filled with radio equipment and computer terminals. He smashed the equipment, cutting off their contact with the outside world. He was isolating them, trapping them in their own fortress. He found their armory, a cavern filled with enough weapons to start a small war. He planted explosives, setting the timers. He was going to turn their own weapons against them. And then he found him. The Colonel. He was in a large, well-lit office, a room that seemed out of place in the dark, damp tunnels. He was a tall, thin man with a cruel face and cold, intelligent eyes. He was sitting behind a large desk, a bottle of whiskey and a glass in front of him. He wasn't alone. Sarah was there, tied to a chair, a gag in her mouth. Brody stood next to her, a triumphant sneer on his face. "I knew you'd come for her," the Colonel said, his voice calm and measured. It was the only logical move. Reacher stood in the doorway, the M16 held loosely in his hands. He looked at Sarah, at the fear in her eyes. He had made a mistake. He had underestimated them. He had walked into their trap. "Let her go," Reacher said, his voice a low growl. The Colonel smiled. "I don't think so," he said. "You've caused me a great deal of trouble, Mr. Reacher. You've disrupted my operations, you've cost me a great deal of money, and you've killed a number of my men. I'm afraid I can't let that go unpunished." He picked up a pistol from his desk and pointed it at Sarah's head. "Now," he said, his voice as cold as ice, "drop the rifle, or the girl dies." Reacher looked at the Colonel, at the pistol in his hand, at the unwavering resolve in his eyes. He knew the man wasn't bluffing. He would kill Sarah without a moment's hesitation. He had no choice. He let the M16 clatter to the floor. Brody moved forward, a smug look on his face. He kicked the rifle away and pulled out a pair of handcuffs. "It's over, Reacher," he said. "You're finished." But it wasn't over. Not yet. As Brody reached for him, Reacher moved. He exploded into action, a blur of speed and power. He kicked Brody in the knee, shattering the kneecap. The sheriff screamed and went down, clutching his leg. The Colonel fired his pistol, but Reacher was already moving, diving behind the desk. The bullet ricocheted off the rock wall. Reacher came up on the other side of the desk, his father's revolver in his hand. He fired once, a single, precise shot. The Colonel's eyes widened in surprise, a small, dark hole appearing in the center of his forehead. He dropped his pistol and slumped forward, dead before he hit the desk. Reacher untied Sarah. She was shaken but unharmed. He helped her to her feet. "It's over," he said. But it wasn't. They could hear shouting in the tunnels, the sound of running feet. The rest of the Colonel's men were coming, and then they heard another sound, a low rumble that grew into a deafening roar. The explosives, the ground shook and the lights flickered and died, plunging the office into darkness. Dust and rock rained down from the ceiling. "Come on!" Reacher shouted, grabbing Sarah's hand. "We have to get out of here!" They ran through the collapsing tunnels, the explosions echoing behind them. They made it to the hidden entrance just as the main tunnel collapsed, sealing off the mines forever. They emerged into the bright desert sunlight, blinking against the glare. The ground was still shaking, and a huge cloud of dust and smoke rose from the mountains. It was over. Ethelred's desert fortress was destroyed. Their operation was in ruins. They walked back to Alcorn. The town was in chaos. People were in the streets, looking up at the smoke-filled sky. They saw the bus, the same bus Reacher had arrived on. The radiator had been fixed. The driver was waving at them, shouting for them to hurry. Reacher looked at Sarah. "Are you coming?" he asked. She shook her head. "This is my town," she said. "I'm staying." She stood on her toes and kissed him on the cheek. "Thank you," she said. Reacher nodded. He turned and walked to the bus, his long strides carrying him away from the town that had almost been his tomb. He got on the bus and found a seat by the window. He didn't look back. He never looked back. The bus pulled away, leaving Alcorn and its ghosts behind. Reacher looked out at the endless desert, at the long, empty road ahead. He didn't know where he was going. He never did. He was just moving, a solitary man on a journey with no destination. And that was the way he liked it.